back to my channel. Today we're going to be talking about One Health specifically through the lens of Indigenous ways of knowing. We had a really engaging seminar with Ms. Tessa Baker, who works alongside Dr. Susan Coots in the Satu settlement area or region in the Northwest Territories on projects pertaining to One Health and wildlife conservation and sustainability. So I really had my eyes opened pertaining to how important wildlife are for those that live in the northern areas of Canada and the different contexts in which these individuals do live. So my first aha moment has to do with these different details pertaining to how northern communities operate and the lack of resources or resource scarcity that they may face. So the first note had to do with winter roads and the fact that in these northern communities, bodies of water can actually be iced over and used as forms of transportation for different resources like oil and gas. So in addition to these winter roads is this idea that any form of transportation does need to be considered for the fact that a lot of these resources are limited and the ways of communicating with northern communities in terms of transport is quite unique. The next little detail had to do with the price of groceries. So as health and society students, we are aware of food deserts and the fact that in northern communities, the price of food can be quite incredibly high. But that being said, there is a massive role for hunting and harvesting for these communities, specifically in terms of incorporating Indigenous ways of knowing into everyday lifestyle. I was actually quite shocked to hear that there was $50 million of replacement in terms of income. In terms of this $50 million of replacement, that's a huge amount of money that is being saved by communities, albeit the fact that there is quite a large income disparity in many communities. So we can see that with Norman Wells, for example, that has quite a disparate income compared to other communities. So the second thought that I had for the day had to do with the perceptions of dogs as working animals or companions in Indigenous communities versus those in more Western communities, specifically in how there's this perception that we don't necessarily treat dogs the same way as quote-unquote white folk. So what I mean by that is I was quite intrigued to hear that as much as dogs have played a really important historical role for resource acquisition and protection for Indigenous communities in the North, that has really transitioned lately and they don't necessarily hold the same role today, despite the fact that these dogs are quite prevalent in the community and thus pose particular health concerns that need to be addressed by veterinary medicine. And that brings me into the second point in terms of how vet med isn't something that's necessarily understood by Indigenous communities. A lot of them didn't necessarily know what the role of a veterinarian was, and that poses some other barriers in terms of accessing proper vaccination, proper wellness exams, and just having that type of role in the community. The third thing pertaining to the dogs that I found quite fascinating was the fact that typically children are the owners of these dogs and children make the calls pertaining to their access to care, surgery. They're the ones who sign off on the consent forms. So that being said, they do play a really important role in terms of upholding their autonomy and their governance, and I feel like that stems back to an Indigenous way of knowing and the fact that these communities often really value the opinions and the place of children, despite the fact that there is, of course, a hierarchy in terms of elders and the like, but children are quite important and really valued, and that kind of stems back to their role in holding on to these dogs and making sure that the dogs are taken care of. That's not necessarily something that parents are involved with, which I thought was quite interesting and quite different from my experience and what I'm familiar with. And the third aha moment had to do with the role-playing activity that we had with the student seminar, and Helen had brought it up as this feeling of being uncomfortable and representing somebody that she clearly is not. Oftentimes when we're discussing Indigenous health or Indigenous conflict, we're talking on behalf of these individuals or we're talking about these individuals and their issues, but we're not talking with them. So that kind of comes to be a really important quality that I'd like to explore in other research that I do, and the fact that having that representation is incredibly important, not only to uphold their value and to empower them in making decisions for their community, but to also not undermine the fact that they know their community best and they are actually the keepers of their own traditional knowledge. So all in all, this seminar was really fantastic, both in terms of the guest lecture and the student seminar, and I felt like I developed a more well-rounded and comprehensive view of what One Health means, particularly as it pertains to day-to-day activities in Indigenous communities. So thanks, and tune in for next week's personal reflection on seminar.